This morning, heading into what we knew would be two big important court hearings on these Trump cases today in federal court in Georgia and federal court in D.C., reporter Alan Foyer wrote a scene-setting piece about those two court hearings today for the New York Times, for the morning paper this morning, sort of reminding us all where this may be heading. He said towards the end of his article this morning, quote, "The timetables for Mr. Trump's 4 trials have taken on outsized importance. That's not only because there are so many of them, but also because they're unfolding against Trump's crowded calendar as the candidate leading the field for the Republican Party's 2024 presidential nomination. As a further complication, Trump has made no secret in private conversations with his aides of his desire to solve his jumble of legal problems by winning the election. Quote, if either of the 2 federal trials he's confronting is delayed until after the election and Trump prevails in that election, he could seek to pardon himself after taking office, or he could have his attorney general simply dismiss the matters altogether." And I know that, learning that Trump has been saying that privately to his staffers is not shocking news per se, right? We've known that was probably what he was planning, probably what he was thinking. But per the New York Times, it does seem sort of significant that that's what he's now telling people. That's what he's telling people he's going to do. He will solve his jumble of legal problems by winning the election. And, whatever you think about that, that's how he's thinking about that. And what does that say about the election for all of the rest of us, right? It means, in his own mind and those of his campaign and his supporters, presumably, these are the stakes. And again, whatever you think about that as a legal strategy for Trump, that is how he is thinking about the election. And that is how he is going to be talking to his supporters and his aides and his campaign about the stakes of the election. The election means one of 2 things, if this is the way he's going to approach it. Either he loses the election and he goes to prison, or he wins the election, he doesn't go to prison, and is that for life, that he gets to be president? Will we keep having more elections, or no? If every election is a new opportunity for him to go to prison, do you think he allows us to have new elections? If those are the stakes, if winning the election is his plan to stay out of prison, what happens in that election if and when he does not win it? Does that kind of an election end with a graceful concession to a fair and square re-elected President Biden? If Trump and his supporters see the stakes as losing and going to prison, or winning and being president, and probably president for life, how should we expect that he and the Republican Party and Republican officials in swing states are going to handle the conduct of that election that Trump may very well lose? And because we are prone to forget, we have to say out loud, that we would be remiss, we would be willfully naive to ask that question as if our politics exists in a vacuum, somewhere outside the rest of our news. As if the politics pages are totally different than the crime pages, right? As if we are not in a moment where far-right politics is coincident with far-right violence, with regular shows of force from paramilitary extreme right groups, and with acts of violence by people who are explicitly and admittedly motivated by far-right eliminationist political ideas. We are prone to forget, but we do not have to forget. So what should we know? What can we know about what happens in far-right politics when it appears to be in nexus with far-right violence that right now is just pinging off the charts?